It was the night of December 24th, 1944, and out in the dark woods of the Hurtgen forest, a knock on the door didn't mean company. It wasn't a neighbor stopping by, and it sure wasn't a friend. A knock like that meant one thing only. It meant death had found you. For 6 straight weeks, the forest along the Belgian-German border had been screaming non-stop. Heavy artillery thundered day and night, ripping ancient pine trees apart and turning them into sharp splinters that littered the ground. The earth itself was frozen solid, so hard that bodies couldn't be buried. The dead were stacked in the snow like chopped firewood, left there waiting for a thaw that never came. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate roll of the dice to smash through the Allied lines. Instead, it turned the forest into a giant meat grinder that chewed up anyone unlucky enough to be there. And right in the middle of that frozen nightmare, sitting squarely in no man's land, stood a small hunting cabin. Inside that cabin, a German woman named Elisabeth Vinken was baking bread. She was alone with her 12-year-old son. Fritz, her husband, was gone, drafted into civil defense to keep the Nazi war machine running. Months earlier, the Wehrmacht had ordered all civilians to evacuate the area, but Elizabeth refused to leave. She believed the deep forest was safer than the bombed-out cities. She thought that if she stayed quiet and kept her head down, the war might simply move past them. She was wrong. That cabin was now the most dangerous place on Earth. It sat directly between the advancing American 151st Infantry and the desperate German Panzer divisions. If the Americans found them, they could be arrested or shot as spies. If the Germans showed up and saw even the slightest sign of disloyalty, they'd be executed for treason on the spot. Elizabeth blew out the candle as a plane roared overhead, its engines straining in the thin, icy air. She didn't know it yet, but within the next hour, this ordinary woman would do something generals, politicians, and entire armies had failed to do for 5 long years. She would stop the war, but first, she had to survive the night. To understand why that Christmas Eve was so impossible, you have to understand the forest itself. The Hurtgen wasn't just a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Since September, the U.S. Army had been bleeding itself dry, trying to push through those dense pine woods. Even at noon, it was dark. The trees were packed so tightly that radios barely worked. The ravines were so steep that tanks slid off narrow roads and disappeared into the shadows. By Christmas Eve, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero. Men on both sides weren't just dying from bullets anymore. They were freezing to death. Boots froze solid to feet. Weapons jammed with ice. Fingers turned black and numb. Elizabeth knew this terrain well. She understood that anyone moving through those woods at night was either hunting or being hunted. She had brought Fritz to that cabin to keep him alive, to keep him innocent for as long as possible. The cabin was solid. It had a wood stove. They had flour and potatoes stored away. They even had a rooster named Hermann, whom Fritz had begged her not to eat until after the holidays. They were trying, in their own small way, to pretend the world wasn't falling apart. But the war was closing in fast. Earlier that afternoon, the distant thunder of artillery had suddenly stopped. That silence was worse than the noise. It meant the lines were shifting. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, there wasn't really a front line anymore. The enemy could be anywhere. At 1800 hours, darkness fell hard and fast. Elizabeth barred the heavy wooden door and lit a single candle. She and Fritz began preparing a small Christmas Eve meal. There was no turkey, no gifts, just the warmth of the stove and the illusion of safety. Then the silence broke. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't shouting. It was a weak, desperate pounding against the door. Elizabeth froze in place. Fritz looked up at her, his eyes wide in the flickering candlelight. The rule was simple. Open the door for no one. But the pounding continued. Then came voices. They weren't speaking German, and they didn't sound like the sharp, barking commands of the Wehrmacht. The language was soft, flowing, and filled with fear. Elizabeth blew out the candle again and stepped toward the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the iron latch. She cracked it open just an inch. Standing in the snow were 3 figures that looked more like ghosts than men. They wore olive-drab uniforms, soaked through and frozen stiff. They had no hats. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. One of them leaned heavily against the doorframe, his skin the color of gray ash. They were American soldiers, the enemy. For a German woman in 1944, this was the moment of truth. Years of propaganda had told her that Americans were gangsters and murderers who would burn her home and kill her child. But that's not what she saw. She saw boys. They were shaking so violently that snow fell from their shoulders. One of them tried to speak. He didn't know German, so he struggled in broken French. He stammered that they were cold. Then he pointed down at the third man, lying motionless in the snow. Elizabeth looked down and saw blood. The man's leg was shredded, soaked red through torn fabric. He was bleeding out. If she shut the door, they'd be dead within an hour. The cold would finish what German bullets had started. If she let them in, she would be committing high treason. The punishment for helping the enemy was death by firing squad. She looked at the wounded boy's face. Then she made her choice. Elizabeth opened the door wide and whispered for them to come inside. The 3 soldiers stumbled into the cabin, dragging the cold in with them. A blast of freezing air swirled around the stove. When the heat hit them, 2 of the men nearly collapsed. Fritz watched from the corner, wide-eyed. These were the monsters he'd been warned about. The youngest looked no older than 18. His name was Jim. The one who spoke French was Ralph. The wounded man was named Herbie. They'd been separated from their unit 3 days earlier during the German breakthrough. Since then, they'd been wandering in circles, hopelessly lost in the Hurtgen maze, hunted by the cold itself. Elizabeth took control. In that moment, she wasn't a German citizen. She was a mother. She ordered Fritz to bring more firewood. She pointed to the table and told the soldiers to lay the wounded man down. She examined the injury. It was bad. A bullet had torn through his upper thigh. He'd lost a lot of blood, but the freezing temperature had tightened the vessels and probably saved his life. Now, as he warmed up, the bleeding started again. Elizabeth didn't have medical supplies. She had bed sheets. She tore her best linens into strips and bound the wound as tightly as she could. Then she sent Fritz to fetch the rooster. There would be no Christmas eggs tomorrow. That night, Hermann became soup, and slowly, the tension in the room began to break. The Americans quickly understood that this woman wasn't going to hurt them. Ralph, the one who knew French, tried to thank her, stumbling over the words. She brushed it off with a wave of her hand and told him to eat, to get warm. For a little while, the war simply stopped existing. For nearly an hour, that cabin was just a cabin. It smelled like roasting chicken and potatoes. The Americans sank into their chairs, their weapons leaned carelessly against the wall. They were too tired to stay alert anymore, too cold, too worn down. Fritz, whose fear had slowly turned into curiosity, sat beside Jim. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of gum, something Fritz had never seen before. He offered it to the boy. It was a strange, peaceful picture. a German mother cooking dinner for 3 American soldiers on Christmas Eve. But the Hurtgen forest never allows peace to last. Around 9 o'clock, there was another knock at the door. This one wasn't weak or desperate. It was sharp, heavy, commanding. 4 hard raps, each one echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. The calm shattered instantly. The Americans reacted at once. Ralph grabbed his carbine. Jim dragged the wounded Herbie toward the back bedroom. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped. Elizabeth's face drained of color. She knew that knock. She motioned for the Americans to stay hidden in the shadows. Then she smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and walked to the door. She prayed it might be a neighbor. She prayed it might even be her husband, somehow home early. She opened the door. 4 men stood on her porch. They weren't ghosts this time. They were German soldiers in heavy gray greatcoats. The man in front was a corporal, with 3 privates behind him. They were armed with Mauser rifles and MP-40 submachine guns. They wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht. The corporal touched the brim of his cap and wished her a Merry Christmas. He explained they'd lost their regiment and spotted smoke from her chimney. They asked if they could rest for a moment. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. These were her own countrymen. But if they stepped inside and saw the American rifles against the wall, or even smelled American cigarettes, everyone in that cabin would be dead in seconds. She could have lied. She could have said her son was sick. But the cold was merciless, and the soldiers were desperate. They would have forced their way in. So Elizabeth made a decision that went against every instinct for survival. She stepped into the doorway, blocking the entrance, making herself look larger than she was. She told them they were welcome to come in and warm themselves. She told them she had soup. The soldiers smiled and started to move forward. Elizabeth raised her hand. She told them there were already guests inside. The corporal stopped. His hand drifted toward the machine gun slung across his chest. He asked who was inside. Elizabeth met his eyes and spoke the word that could get her killed. Americans. The reaction was instant. All 4 German soldiers raised their weapons. Safety catches snapped off loudly in the frozen air. The corporal's face hardened with rage. Enemy soldiers were inside a German home. Elizabeth spoke quickly, not stepping aside. She told him there were 3 Americans. 1 was wounded. She said they were just like the Germans, lost, freezing, and hungry. The corporal shouted that they were the enemy and stepped forward, lifting his weapon toward the door. Inside the cabin, Ralph and Jim had their rifles trained on the wood, fingers tight on the triggers. 1 shot, just 1, from either side, would turn that small room into a slaughterhouse. Fritz cowered under the table. This was the moment war demanded blood. Violence was supposed to be unavoidable, but Elizabeth Vinken did something impossible. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She spoke to the corporal, not as a soldier, but as a boy. She told him to listen to her. She told him there would be no shooting here, not tonight. It was Christmas Eve. The corporal stared at her and spat that they were Americans. Elizabeth raised her voice. She told him the soldiers outside could be her sons. The ones inside could be her sons, too. She told him they all had mothers waiting for them, just like his mother was waiting for him. Weapons were pointed at her chest. She told them they would not kill each other in her house. She ordered them to put their guns down. The wind howled through the trees. The corporal looked back at his men. They were young, hungry, exhausted, and the smell of roasting chicken drifted through the open door, reminding them of a life none of them had lived in a long time. Elizabeth held out her hand. She demanded their weapons. It was insane. A soldier never gives up his gun. That's rule number 1. But there was something in her voice, something final that cut straight through their training. The corporal looked at the doorway, then at Elizabeth, then down at his frozen hands. Slowly, he unslung his MP40. He nodded to his men. One by one, they handed their rifles and machine guns to the woman in the apron. Elizabeth carried them outside and stacked them by the woodpile. Then she turned back and told the corporal to come inside before he froze to death. The Germans entered the cabin. Inside, the Americans were frozen in place, rifles still aimed. Elizabeth walked over to them and spoke in French to Ralph. She told him it was time to eat. Then she held out her hand for his rifle. This was the most dangerous moment of all. The Germans were unarmed. The Americans were not. If they fired now, the enemy squad would be dead. Ralph looked at Elizabeth, then at the German soldiers warming their hands by the stove, acting as if the Americans weren't even there. He glanced at Herbie, pale and barely conscious. Ralph lowered his rifle and handed it over. Jim followed. Elizabeth took the American weapons outside and placed them beside the German ones. When she came back in, the air was thick with tension. On one side of the cabin sat 3 American soldiers. On the other side sat 4 Germans. Between them stood a mother, her 12-year-old son, and a rooster roasting over the fire. They stared at each other, men who had spent weeks trying to kill one another, men taught to hate the uniform across the room. The silence was heavy, filled with the distant ghosts of the battle still raging miles away. Then the German corporal did something no one expected. He noticed Herbie grimacing in pain. The corporal stood up. The American stiffened, but he didn't attack. He walked over and knelt beside the wounded man. He spoke in German, then in broken English. He said he had been a medical student before the war. He asked to see the wound. The German soldier carefully examined the American's leg. He opened his own medical kit, something the Americans didn't have at all. He cleaned the wound properly and replaced the makeshift bandages with clean ones. He explained that the freezing cold had likely saved the young man's life by slowing the bleeding. But he warned that without a real doctor soon, the leg could still be lost. When the corporal finally stood up, the feeling in the room had shifted. The tension wasn't gone, but it had changed shape. They weren't enemies in that moment. They weren't even soldiers anymore. They were just men who had survived another night. Elizabeth announced that dinner was ready. She dragged the small table into the center of the cabin. There weren't enough chairs, so 2 of the German soldiers sat on the edge of the bed. Everyone bowed their heads. Elizabeth said one word, grace, and thanked God for the food. She asked for peace. When she finished with Amen, voices from both sides of the table echoed it back. Amen. For the next hour, something close to a miracle unfolded in the Hürtgen forest. The rooster was carved. Potatoes were passed from hand to hand. At first, no one spoke. Then the German corporal pulled out a bottle of wine he'd been saving and poured it into mugs for everyone, even the Americans. Ralph found a pack of cigarettes and offered them to the Germans. Slowly, conversation began. Not about the war, not about Hitler or Roosevelt. They talked about home. The Germans were from Dusseldorf. The Americans came from New York and Ohio. They passed around photographs of girlfriends and wives, holding them close to the firelight. It became clear that beneath the different uniforms, they were the same. Cold, afraid, homesick. Every one of them just wanted to survive and go home. Fritz watched everything. He would carry this night with him for the rest of his life. He saw a German soldier break bread and hand it to an American. He saw enemies laugh at a joke, neither fully understood because of the language barrier. For one night, inside one small cabin, the war had stopped. There was no shelling, no gunfire, just Christmas. But as the night stretched on, Morning crept closer. They all knew what daylight would bring. When the sun rose, the truce would die. Rifles would be picked up again. They would step back into the snow and become enemies once more. Christmas morning didn't arrive so much as the darkness slowly faded into a bruised gray light. Inside the cabin, the magic drained away with the mist. The fire had burned down to embers. Soldiers who had slept shoulder to shoulder on the wooden floor began to stir. For a few hours they had been brothers. Now, as light filtered through the shutters, they remembered who they were. They looked at their uniforms. They looked at the men beside them. The war was waiting just outside the door. Elizabeth Vinken was already awake. She quietly prepared a simple breakfast, oatmeal and coffee, or at least the dark, bitter water that passed for coffee in 1944. Her movements were calm, but her face was tight. She knew the next decision would decide whether they lived or died. The German corporal stood first. He buttoned his heavy gray tunic and, as a medical student once more, checked on Herbie. The bleeding had stopped, but the leg was stiff and swollen. The message was clear. He needed a hospital, and soon. Then came the moment everyone feared. The corporal pulled a folded map from his pocket. It was a detailed Wehrmacht tactical map, filled with information meant to stay secret. He spread it across the table and motioned for Ralph to come closer. Ralph hesitated, then stepped forward. The corporal pointed to a town marked on the map, Monschau. He told Ralph that the Americans believed they still controlled it, but overnight the Germans had retaken the crossroads. If the Americans headed that way, they would walk straight into a Tiger tank. They wouldn't stand a chance. Then he traced a different route. He pointed to a narrow stream cutting through a ravine. He told them to follow the water. It would lead them back toward American lines near the border. It was longer, harder, but empty. It was the only way they'd live. Ralph stared at the map, then at the German officer who was handing him survival itself. What the corporal was doing could have gotten him executed for treason, but inside that cabin, the rules of the Reich didn't matter. Elizabeth handed the Americans the last of the bread. She told them it was time. They moved toward the door. Outside, the spell would break. Elizabeth stepped out first and walked to the woodpile where the weapons lay stacked. The metal was coated in frost, cold enough to burn bare skin. She picked up German Mausers and American M1 carbines and handed them back to their owners. The moment the men took their weapons, their posture changed. Shoulders tightened, eyes hardened. They were soldiers again. Safeties clicked off. Logic said they should arrest each other or shoot. They stood 5 feet apart, fully armed, in the middle of a killing ground. No one raised a gun. The German corporal looked at the Americans. He didn't salute. That would have been wrong. He simply nodded and said one word to Ralph. Good luck. Then the Germans turned south and marched into the trees. Their gray coats vanished into the winter fog. They never looked back. The Americans waited until they were gone. Then they turned north. Ralph and Jim supported Herbie between them, his arms draped over their shoulders. They moved slowly toward the stream the corporal had marked. Elizabeth and Fritz stood on the porch and watched them disappear. Within minutes, the forest swallowed both groups. The clearing was empty. Only 2 sets of footprints remained, leading in opposite directions. Then even that was gone. For Fritz Vinken, the rest of the war blurred together. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for another month. Artillery returned. Bombers filled the sky. Spring eventually came, and with it, the collapse of the Third Reich. Elizabeth and Fritz survived. They kept their secret. If anyone had known that she sheltered the enemy and disarmed a German patrol, she would have been executed as a traitor. But for one night, in one cabin, A mother stopped the war. She never reported that night to the authorities. Not once. She only ever spoke about it to Fritz. She made him promise to remember what happened in that cabin. She told him that character isn't something you talk about when things are easy. It's what you do when the world is falling apart around you. She told him that even in the deepest darkness, a single human being can still strike a match. Elizabeth Vinkin passed away in the 1960s. She died without ever knowing the fate of the 7 soldiers who had shared her table. She never learned whether the Americans made it back alive. She never knew if the young German boys survived the meat grinder of the Ardennes. Fritz grew up. He got married. He put distance between himself and the ghosts of Europe. Eventually, he immigrated to the United States, the country of the soldiers he had met that night. He settled in Hawaii and opened a small bakery in Honolulu. Every day he kneaded dough with his hands, just like his mother had done in that cabin long ago. But Christmas Eve of 1944 never left him. The memory followed him like a shadow. Some days it felt more like a dream than something real. He wondered if his mind had made it all up. War does strange things to children. Had there really been a rooster named Herman? Had a German officer truly bandaged an American soldier? As Fritz grew older, the need to know became stronger. He needed proof. He needed to find them. In the 1980s, Fritz began searching. It felt hopeless from the start. He didn't know last names. He only remembered first names: Ralph, Jim, Herbie. He didn't know ranks or units. He was looking for 3 men among 16 million American veterans. He wrote to U.S. Army Archives. They told him without service numbers or surnames. There was nothing they could do. He contacted veteran organizations. He told his story to anyone willing to listen. Most people didn't believe him. It sounded too perfect, too emotional. A Christmas truce in the middle of the bloodiest battle of the war. It felt like something from a movie, not history. Years went by. Fritz grew old. He slowly accepted that the secret of the cabin would die with him. The soldiers were probably gone, killed in the fighting or lost to time. The story would remain just that, a story. Then, in 1995, everything changed. A television producer heard about a baker in Honolulu with an unbelievable tale tied to the Battle of the Bulge. The show was Unsolved Mysteries, known for finding answers where none seemed possible. They interviewed Fritz and aired his story across America. Fritz sat in his living room in Hawaii and watched the reenactment of his mother, the cabin, the snow. He hoped, quietly, that somewhere in a nursing home or a living room in Ohio or New York, an old man was watching too. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. The phone stayed silent. Then a letter arrived. It came from a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland. The handwriting was shaky, the kind written by hands worn down by time. It wasn't from one of the soldiers. It was from a chaplain. The chaplain explained that one of his patients, an elderly man named Ralph Blank, had been watching television in the common room. Ralph was suffering from dementia. Most days he didn't recognize his own family. His memories were slipping away piece by piece. But when Unsolved Mysteries aired, Ralph had stopped shaking. He stared at the screen, raised a trembling finger, and whispered, "I know her. That's the woman who saved my life." Fritz booked a flight immediately, nearly 5,000 miles from Honolulu to Maryland. He was terrified. What if it was a mistake? What if the man couldn't remember anymore? When Fritz arrived at the nursing home, he was led into a quiet room where an old man sat in a wheelchair. The man looked nothing like the frozen ghost from 1944. He was thin, fragile, his skin like paper. Fritz didn't know what to say. He simply asked, "Are you Ralph?" The old man looked up. For a moment his cloudy eyes cleared. He didn't see a middle-aged baker. He saw a 12-year-old boy standing in the snow. He smiled. "Your mother?" Ralph whispered. "Your mother made me soup." Fritz broke down. It was real. Every bit of it. Ralph told him they had survived. The German corporal's map had been right. The stream led them safely back to American lines. They carried Herbie the entire way. They lived because of the directions given by a German officer who chose mercy over orders. Then Ralph revealed something else. He opened a drawer beside his bed and pulled out a worn leather map case. Inside was the actual German Wehrmacht map from that Christmas morning. He also removed a compass, stamped with a 1943 manufacturer's mark. Ralph explained that before leaving the cabin, the German corporal had pressed it into his hand and told him to trust the needle. That compass guided them through the ravine and brought them home. Ralph had kept it for 50 years, waiting to say thank you. But the story wasn't finished. Ralph told Fritz another man from that night was still alive. Woodrow Woody Vost, the quiet soldier who helped carry Herbie, was living in Youngstown, Ohio. Fritz picked up the phone, his hands shaking, and dialed the number. When an old man answered, Fritz said, "I'm the boy from the cabin." There was a long silence. Then Fritz heard something that shattered him. Woody was crying. Woody told him he had never forgotten. For 50 years, he had told the story of the German mother and the Christmas truce to anyone who would listen. He told his wife, his children, his grandchildren. No one ever truly believed him. It sounded like a fairy tale meant to soften the horror of war. "You're real," Woody kept saying into the phone. "You're real." In 1996, 52 years after the guns went silent in the Hurtgen forest, the survivors finally met face to face. It happened in a small hotel in Pennsylvania. There were no speeches, no medals, no officials, just two old men who had once been enemies, and the boy who watched them share soup on Christmas Eve. When Fritz walked into the room, time collapsed. Woody stood up. He wasn't that frightened young soldier anymore, shaking in the snow. Now he was a grandfather, gray, worn by time. But when he looked at Fritz, his eyes were exactly the same. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him, holding him the way a father holds a son he thought he'd lost forever. "Your mother saved my life," Woody whispered. "I lived a full life because of her. I have children. I have grandchildren. None of them would be here if she hadn't opened that door." They sat together for hours. They talked about the smell of the roasting rooster. They talked about the warmth of the stove on frozen hands. They talked about Elizabeth Vinkin. They remembered her strength. They remembered how she stood between 7 armed men and demanded peace. To the world, she was just another anonymous German woman lost to history. To them, she was a saint. But even in that moment of joy, there was a shadow hanging over the room, a question that had no easy answer. "What about the others?" Fritz finally asked. "What about the corporal? What about the German boys?" The room fell silent. Fritz had searched for them, too, for years. He had dug through German military records. He had studied unit histories, 116th Panzer Division, 275th Infantry Division. He had searched for any trace of a medical student from Dusseldorf. Thus he found nothing. History is often colder than we want it to be. The Americans had walked north from that cabin, towards stabilizing Allied lines, towards safety. But the German soldiers had gone south, straight back into the teeth of the American counteroffensive. In the days after Christmas, 1944, the skies finally cleared. Allied aircraft, grounded for weeks by snow, returned in force. Bombers tore into German positions. The forest was carpeted with fire. German infantry losses in the Hürtgen forest that week were catastrophic. In some units, nearly 90% were killed or wounded. It is almost certain the young corporal, the medical student who bandaged his enemy, did not survive the war. He likely died within days, maybe even hours, after leaving that cabin. The 3 boys with him probably fell alongside him, nameless, swallowed by the mud and trees of the Ardennes. Their story lived only in the memories of the men they chose not to kill. That truth adds a quiet tragedy to Elizabeth Vinken's act. She didn't save the German soldiers' lives in the long run. She couldn't stop the bombs. She couldn't stop the tanks. But she gave them something just as powerful. One last night of humanity. One warm meal. One moment of laughter. One evening where they weren't killers or targets, just human beings. Elizabeth Vinken may not have saved their bodies, but she may have saved their souls. Fritz Vinken passed away on December 8, 2002, just weeks before Christmas. He died knowing the story was real. He died knowing his mother's courage had echoed through generations. Because of that one night, Ralph Blank lived long enough to hold his great-grandchildren. Woody lived to see a new century. The ripples of that single act of kindness spread farther than Elizabeth could ever have imagined. Today, the cabin in the Hürtgen forest is gone. The trees have grown back, covering the scars of artillery. Foxholes are nothing more than shallow dips in the earth, softened by moss. Hikers walk those woods now, unaware they're stepping across ground where something extraordinary once happened. But the story remains, and it stands as a challenge to every one of us. We live in a world that constantly tries to divide us. We're told who our enemies are, who to fear, who to shut out. It's easy to follow orders. It's easy to keep the door locked. Opening it is the hard part. Elizabeth Vinken wasn't a soldier. She had no weapon, no rank, no authority. She was just a mother with bread in her hands and a fierce love for her son. And yet, in that moment, she held more power than the entire Third Reich. She proved that even in the darkest hour of the deadliest century in human history, humanity could not be extinguished. Peace isn't something signed by diplomats in marble halls. Peace is a choice, a split-second decision made in a small kitchen, surrounded by snow. It's the choice to see the person standing in front of you, not as a uniform or a target, but as someone cold, hungry, and afraid. This Christmas, and every day after, remember the woman in the woods, remember the night the war stopped, and ask yourself, if the knock came at your door, would you have the courage to open it? Thank you for listening to this story. We spend hundreds of hours uncovering forgotten chapters of history because we believe they matter. Heroes like Elizabeth Vinken deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel something, please take a second and hit the like button. It's a small action, but it helps make sure stories like this reach people who need to hear them. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We're building a community that cares about truth, about memory, and about the voices history almost lost. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future documentaries. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Be honest. What would you have done if you were in that cabin? Could you have broken bread with the enemy? And finally, share this story. Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that even in the worst of times, there is still good in this world. I'm yours, truly, signing off. Until next time, keep the history alive.